.org. Letters on Politics is next.
This is Pacifica Radio's Letters on Politics. On today's show,
what Hurston understood about African American folklore is that it was where we were going to find not only our understanding of the African American folk, but that which was original to the African American folk, that original aspect of us that had its roots in Africa.
Zora Neale Hurston is well remembered today for her novel Their Eyes Were Watching God and as a leading figure in the Harlem Renaissance. Not as well remembered, but as important as her work as a professionally trained anthropologist and her efforts to preserve African American folklore. For the first time, Zora Neale Hurston's first manuscript has just been published into a book. It's called Barracoon, and it's about a man named Kosala, who was the last surviving person in 1927 that was kidnapped from Africa, enslaved in the United States, freed, and then had to figure out how to make a new life in a foreign land, that in the American South. We'll talk about these two remarkable stories, that of Kosala and that of Zora Neale Hurston, with Deborah G. Plant. She is a scholar of African American history, a specialist on Zora Neale Hurston, and editor of this new book called Barracoon. That's next on Letters on Politics. But first, the news.
For Pacifica Radio, I'm Eileen Alfandary. The head of an association of federal judges has called an emergency telephone meeting to discuss growing concerns about the intervention of President Trump and senior Justice Department officials in politically sensitive cases. That's according to USA Today. It quoted Philadelphia District Judge Cynthia Rufus saying the group could not wait until its spring conference to address the issues. Roof was appointed by former Republican President George W. Bush. The judge told USA Today the group of more than 1,000 federal judges called for the meeting after Trump last week criticized prosecutors' initial sentencing recommendation for his friend Roger Stone, and the Justice Department overruled the prosecutors. Trump has also attacked federal Judge Amy Berman Jackson, who's presiding over Stone's case and will decide his sentence. The emergency meeting of the judges comes after more than 2,000 former Justice Department officials who served in both Republican and Democratic administrations called on Attorney General Bill Barr to resign. Their letter said Barr and Trump have openly and repeatedly flouted the fundamental principle that prohibits political interference in a criminal prosecution. Trump is at it again today, tweeting that the judge in the Stone case should grant the request for a new trial. Former New York City mayor and billionaire Michael Bloomberg will be on the Democratic presidential debate stage for the first time tomorrow night when the candidates debate in Las Vegas. Bloomberg qualified after a new poll showed him with 19% support nationally among Democrats, in second place behind Bernie Sanders, who was the top choice of 31%. Joe Biden was third with 15%, Elizabeth Warren 12%, Amy Klobuchar 9%, and Pete Buttigieg 8%. For those under the age of 45, Sanders was the runaway leader with 54%. The survey of slightly over 1,400 adults was conducted February 13th through the 16th by the Marist poll. As Bloomberg climbs in the polls, his Democratic rivals have stepped up their attacks on him, pointing to his past support for stop-and-frisk policing tactics, which he has repudiated, remarks about redlining, and for trying to buy the election. Scott Bobber reports from a Bernie Sanders rally in Richmond, California.
Thousands of Bernie Sanders supporters filled the Craneway Pavilion in Richmond. Sanders began by saying that his number one priority was getting President Trump out of the White House.
We are going to defeat Donald Trump because the American people do not want a president who is a pathological liar.
Sanders also took a swipe at Democratic candidate Mike Bloomberg, lumping the former New York mayor in with President Trump as a corrupt billionaire throwing his economic weight around.
Now, Mr. Bloomberg, like anybody else, has a right to run for president. He does not have a right to buy the presidency.
In Richmond, I'm Scott Baba, Pacifica Radio, KPFA.
20 teenagers, including one as young as 13, were arrested in a Green New Deal climate justice protest at the Capitol.
Which side are you on now? Which side are you on
The teens held signs saying Green New Deal now and stood under a banner reading, "Senators, step up or step aside." The United Nations Human Rights Chief says Syrian government forces and their allies should allow humanitarian corridors into conflict areas in northwest Syria. Michelle Bachelet said it's cruel beyond belief that civilians are living under scraps of plastic sheeting and in freezing conditions while getting bombed. 10 medical facilities and 19 educational facilities were either directly hit or affected by military strikes nearby. UN human rights spokesman Rupert Colville said the actions could amount to war crimes.
The sheer quantity of attacks on these hospitals, medical facilities, schools would suggest that they can't all be accidental. And at a minimum, even if they were accidental, it shows lack of proportionality, necessity, precaution, and so on, all of which can contribute to something being attributed as a war crime.
More than 900,000 Syrians displaced from their homes since the beginning of December by the conflict. I'm Eileen Alfandary. Letters and Politics is next.
Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Zora Neale Hurston is firmly in the pantheon of great American writers of the early 20th century, and her novels are still widely read today, both inside and outside the university, especially her classic, Their Eyes Were Watching God. She was a pioneering figure in the literary and artistic movement of the Harlem Renaissance, and perhaps not as well known, but still as important for her work as an anthropologist in collecting and preserving African-American folklore, stories that she saw as a huge American asset and critical in countering the white narrative of black people in the United States. The manuscript from her first book was never published, well, at least not until now, and is a book based on her interviews in 1927 with the last surviving person at the time who was kidnapped out of Africa, brought over the Middle Passage through the bottom of a ship, enslaved for a little more than 5 years, freed, and then have to figure out how to make a new life in the Jim Crow South. His American name was Cudjo Lewis. His African name, Oluwale Kosola. Zora Neale Hurston's manuscript of his story has now been published by Amistad, which is from HarperCollins, and it's called Barracoon, the story of the last black cargo. It is edited by Deborah G. Plant, who now joins me via Skype from Florida to talk about these incredible stories, both of Cudjo Lewis and also of Zora Neale Hurston as an anthropologist. Deborah G. Plant is an African-American literature and African studies scholar with a special interest in Zora Neale Hurston, and she, again, joins me via Skype. Deborah G. Plant, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Well, thank you, and it's my pleasure to be here. I look forward to our conversation about Barracoon.
As do I, and also to talk about Zora Neale Hurston as an anthropologist, which is a very important story. Again, I think most people know of Zora Neale Hurston for her book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, but also important is her anthropological work. So let's begin there. Tell me about Zora Neale Hurston as an anthropologist.
Hurston, as an anthropologist, as a social scientist in general, is someone who's just vital to everything about what we understand about African Americans, the African American folk, and what have you. And that aspect of study in terms of anthropology at large. So what we know is that Hurston began her anthropological studies at Barnard College, where she came into the knowing, the knowledge of Franz Boas, who is the renowned father of American cultural anthropology. And so she took courses at Columbia where he was a professor. And she studied with him. She studied with Melville Herskovitz, Ruth Benedict. She knew Margaret Mead, all of these kinds of things. And so she was very young, in terms of her years as a college student into that field. And what I mean by that is that she began to study anthropology before she even completed her undergraduate degree at Barnard College in English. And so we see this formalizing of her skill and ability in relation to social science and in specific relation to anthropology and ethnography and folklore collecting. But in reality, it started in Eatonville, where she listened to the stories of people in her town, the sermons that her father would give on a Sunday morning in church and things of that nature. And, she loved telling stories herself, and she loved listening to stories. And she would talk about in Dust Tracks on the Road, her autobiography, she would talk about how she would go to Joe Clark's store, and she would be listening, to the stories and the storytellers. And then she would just, as she put it, drag her feet getting back home. Her mother would have to call for her to come back home because she was so immersed in listening to these stories. And in doing that, of course, she was developing her ear, not just learning the content of stories and the form of stories and how they're told and what have you, but also the listening, which is very important in terms of her ethnographic skills. And so you could say that she was a storyteller as well as, a social scientist who understood those very basic ideas about ethnography, even from her earliest years. And this is very important because this is a major part of who she is. We know her, like you said, mostly in relation to Their Eyes Were Watching God. So we know her as a writer, as a novelist. But this part of her, the social science part of her, we are not that familiar with. And we don't yet, until now, have the kind of perspective that allows us to understand her on that level. So what we have with Barracoon is her first book-length work. And this book, which was not published until now, she completed a draft of it in 1931. This constitutes her first work. And she was writing that story while she was also very much immersed in collecting folklore, folk tales in that region. And she was also working on formulating her ideas about Musing Men, which was her other major anthropological work. And so these works come at the forefront of her career, not later, although they were published later.
This is all happening before she becomes this known writer.
Absolutely. We haven't had Jonas Gorvine yet, which was published in 1934. Certainly not Their Eyes, which came later in 1937, or her later works. All of this is going on before we know her as a writer of novels. The best we know about her as a writer before Jonas Gorvine is in relation to the short stories that she wrote and won awards for and that kind of thing. So we have a sense of her writing as a writer through those short stories, but the novels began to come in 1934.
Tell me about the importance she put in particular, African-American folklore. I think these are my words, but I think she says something to the effect of African-American folklore was this country's greatest asset.
Yeah, her perception and feeling that African-American folklore was the greatest cultural wealth on the continent. What Hurston understood about African-American folklore is that it was where we were going to find not only our understanding of the African-American folk, but that which was original to the African-American folk, that original aspect of us that had its roots in Africa. This is very important in relation to the objectives of the Harlem Renaissance period, where Harlem's Renaissance pundits were looking for exploring ways to basically show and present to white America that which was original to African Americans. And Hurston knew that from her studies as an anthropologist that the repository of those aspects that were original to African Americans would be amongst the folk. And so she had the skills, one of the very few to have the skills to go amongst the folk, being of the folk herself, and being able to collect the songs, the tales, the stories, the sermons, all of those forms of oral cultural expression. And what's very important about that is it's through cultural expression that people tend to evaluate a people. What culturally do you bring to the table of humankind and human evolution? What's your contribution to that? And it was assumed, because of racism and prejudice and stereotypes and all of that African Americans had nothing. And so the Harlem Renaissance period was about saying, yes, we do. And, it was the job of those, what they call young new Negroes at the time, to present these cultural artifacts.
I think of Elaine Locke, who we've done a show on not too long ago.
Well, yes, he was very much at the forefront of the Harlem Renaissance period. And, he's considered one of the architects of that period, along with W.B. Du Bois and Charles Johnson and James Weldon Johnson and people of that nature. And this is what they would do. This part of their job, so to speak, was to find these quote-unquote young new Negroes and support them in every way that they could in terms of their work and their ability to produce, connecting them with publishers, with producers, with people who had money and all of that kind of thing, so that they could produce those forms of cultural expression that could then be basically shown to the world to say, yes, we have a rich heritage too. And not only that, one of the important things about Hurston and her work is that what she wanted to do by way of introducing the public, the reading public, to the African American folk is what she says in her introduction to Music Men. She says she wanted us to see that which the soul lives by. And that's very important, because it was assumed by many who were, tainted with notions of white supremacy and what have you, that not only were African Americans not human, we lacked some depth of spirit. And this was, one of the ideas, the notions that Hurston was very committed to debunking, not through any confrontation, so to speak, against those ideas and ideologies, but by showing what we have. Not only in books, the books that she wrote, but also in terms of her work as a dramatist.
Zora Neale Hurston in 1927 would travel to Mobile, Alabama, where we have Oluwale Kosola, also known as Cujo Lewis. What name do you go by in conversation?
I use Kosola.
Then we'll go with Kosola. Mm-hmm. She goes and meets Kosola in Mobile, Alabama. Again, Kosola, he's not an unknown figure at this time.
That's right.
He's been written about before by others.
Yes. But she goes mainly because it's part of her assignment when she's in the field on behalf of Carter G. Woodson, who was the editor of the Journal of Negro History and Culture, and also on behalf of Franz Boas, her professor and mentor. Carter G. Woodson had heard about Kosola, and he had heard about his experience of being captured on the continent of Africa, and he wanted Hurston to capture that story for him. And so while she's in the field, she goes to Mobile, to Africatown, which is that community called Plateau today, but then it was just simply Africatown, which is not very far from Mobile in Alabama. So she goes there to ask Kosola about his experiences being captured and brought to Alabama by way of the Middle Passage. And she interviews him, as well as collects information from the Alabama Historical Society, and she compiles that into a report that she submits to him. And so that is the beginning of her communication with Kosola. So evidently she saw and felt and heard in Kosola's story much, much more that she could get from him in terms of his full story. And so she returns to Africatown toward the latter part of 1927 in December, and she comes again in January, February of 28. And she, over that period of time, begins to have those interviews with him, have those conversations with him, where she draws him out and gets his full story about his life before captivity, the capture, the being detained at the Barracoons at the coast of Ouida, what we know it today as Benin, and the Middle Passage into enslavement in Alabama, and his life afterwards. So she managed to capture the full spectrum, the full continuum of his life over that period of time.
Deborah Plant, let's talk about Oluwole Kosola. His story in itself is fascinating. As I said at the beginning, there are really two fascinating stories here that we're talking about that intersect, Kosola and also Zora Neale Hurston. Tell me about, he lives in Africa, Western Africa, I think in around Nigeria, is that correct?
In that region, yes.
Yeah, and he was there until 19. So his formidable years, he really did grow up in Western Africa.
That's right. He grew up in a town called Bante, and he was an Isha Yoruba, and they were an agricultural people and also a peaceful people. And Kosola talks about his growing up time, the customs and the rituals that he experienced growing into his young manhood, learning how to hunt, learning how to track, learning how to defend his community, becoming a soldier, not so much a soldier so that, they can conduct campaigns of war, but because there were those groups that did conduct campaigns of war, they needed to be in some way prepared to protect and defend themselves. And so he was one of the, he had membership in the Oro Society, which was that group of young men who were pledged to take care of their community. And so, and he talks about being a young man who sees a girl and he wants to, maybe marry her. And so he tells his parents, when you see so-and-so, you be kind to her, you be nice to her. And so, this is an indication that he's ready to get married. And he's in the process, actually, of going through the ritual to prepare him for marriage when there's this raid on his village. And so he talks about how, the Amazon warriors, these were women soldiers who were part of the Daomian army, who entered into their homes, their village in pre-dawn time and just surprised them in their waking and just committed all kind of violence and slaughter and capturing those that they felt were able-bodied and could be good, quote-unquote, specimens as slaves. And so he saw his king be killed and beheaded, and so many of his community in his village to be, destroyed. And it was just an awful, traumatic event that he never really could get past that. And, who could? Because in that raid, he lost everyone he knew. Everyone he knew.
When he told Zora Neale Hurston this, and when he was done relaying the story, she just left him as he just stared, I think, at smoke from a fire. Couldn't even, like he was so wrapped up in his own thoughts.
Exactly.
He didn't say goodbye.
Yes, exactly.
And then many years later.
Yeah, and that's how indelibly marked, this experience was on his mind and his heart and his soul. And it's very important, she captures this and she presents it in the narrative in such a way that we feel his pain. We're right there with him, looking, into the abyss of the past where such trauma had taken place. And what's very important about this is that this trauma that African peoples experience, if you have any human feeling in you at all, you can't help but be touched by that. And you can't help but understand something about the soul of a human being and how that trauma can just really, it has such a terrible effect on the body, mind, and the spirit.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Deborah G. Plant, African-American literary critic and scholar of Africana Studies, with a special interest in the writer Zora Neale Hurston, author, of course, of the book that she's best known and remembered for, Their Eyes Were Watching God. But also really important about Zora Neale Hurston is she was an incredibly important early 20th century anthropology as she dedicated her life and her life's work in preserving African-American stories and folklore. In 1927, she met frequently with Kosala, who was the last, at the time, surviving person who was kidnapped in Western Africa, brought to the United States through the Middle Passage at the bottom of a boat, enslaved in the American South, then freed after the Civil War, and then having to make a new life in a world dominated by Jim Crow laws. One of her first manuscripts by Zora Neale Hurston actually is this story of Kosala that remained in a desk drawer for many years unpublished until recently. And I just find it wild that it remained unpublished because it's an amazing story. It's a story that in vivid detail, and Zora Neale Hurston takes Kosala's story and puts it in his voice, and it's told in the first person, and you get this entire life spectrum that Kosala had to go through, from living his first 19 years in Western Africa as a young man. You get this beautiful scene as he's trying to woo this other young woman to be his wife, and Kosala is just this incredibly endearing character. And I say character, he's not a novel. This is his life story, but you just can't help but really feel for Kosala. He's just a sweet young man, and a sweetness that stays with him as you go through his whole life, even into his old age, as he's meeting with Zora Neale Hurston. And you get the story just in this really vivid detail of how, when he was 19, when there's this neighboring tribe that was all powerful, that was known for kidnapping people and then selling them into slavery, and that's what happened to him. And there were female warriors that were a part of that, and they come and they capture him and they sell him to slave traders, who then bring him over the Middle Passage into the United States. And just what his life then, again, this is 1927 when he's telling his story to Zora Neale Hurston. So he's also a freedman for many years, though, albeit living in the Jim Crow South, and what he and other former slaves would band together to create new communities. I mean, this story is like, it's like a bridge from Africa to America, and it's such an important story that I think this book, which is called Barracoon, The Story of the Last Black Cargo, again, this is the life of Kosala told by the great Zora Neale Hurston, should be required reading. It's one of those it's one of my favorite books, to be quite frank. And the reason one of the reasons, for many reasons I just pointed out, but it's also one of those shorter books, right? Just a little over 100 pages that you can get through in a couple of days, not one of those tomes in which, I usually will be intimidated by, like, this is going to take 2 months for me to read. That's not what kind of book this is. And it's readable, it's powerful. And I couldn't recommend it more. And here, as we are smack dab in the middle of our 2020 winter fund drive, I am very happy to be able to offer it to you for your support of this radio program, Letters and Politics, and of course this radio station that you are listening to. And if you can afford a $100 contribution to us this morning, we will send you this very book, The Story of the Last Black Cargo. That's the subtitle. The actual title is Barracoon by Zora Neale Hurston, and it was edited and has a forward in here by our guest today, Deborah G. Plant. The phone number is, if you're listening to KPFA or KFCF, or if you're listening in Santa Cruz, well, really, Northern California through the Central Valley. The phone number to make that contribution is 1-800-439-5732, 1-800-439-5732, and online at kpfa.org. And for our friends in Southern California listening to KPFK in Los Angeles, the phone number is 818-985-5735, 818-985-5735, or online at kpfk.org. Want to put out a special appeal today to you for your support. If you can't do $100 or aren't interested in donating $100 but can donate $25 or $50, $75, if you can donate $200 or more, what we need to do today is really important, is that we make our $3,000 goal. Now, we haven't made that $3,000 goal yet in this fund drive. A big reason, you may have noticed this last week, we actually had to re-air some things because I was out with a terrible flu. And it came right at the end as we were doing our sort of 3-week journey into constitutional journey into the impeachment trial, the Senate impeachment trial of President Donald Trump. At the end of that, I just got knocked down with this terrible flu. And so I was actually out last week, and we had to go to some of the older shows that we have done. And, well, it really has us behind at this moment. And we can't be behind because we're public radio, and we exist at what we like to call a fund drive to fund drive kind of in existence. And it's kind of like, a paycheck to paycheck kind of in existence. If you miss a paycheck, or if it comes incredibly short than what you had planned or budgeted, well, then it can be very hard to make ends meet at the end of the month. And so we need to really pick it up today. For me, it's still important to bring a show that I think is educational, that I hope deepens your day. I hope this program is something that adds value to your life, and that's how we want to do it. We want to make the goal, but we also want to bring you the program that we do around here, because we think this is the heart of public broadcasting. Not this program necessarily, but just the ideas of what we're trying to do with it, of bringing educational programming that, I hope deepens your understanding of the world you live in and the country you live in. We want to bring that kind of programming, and at the same time be able to meet our minimum fundraising goals, which is $3,000. So the number again for our listeners to KPFA and also KFCF, 1-800-439-5732, 1-800-439-5732, and online at kpfa.org. And in Southern California, listening to KPFK, that number is 818-985-5735, 818-985-5735, and of course, online at kpfk.org. We now return to our conversation with Deborah Plant about both Zora Neale Hurston and Kosala.
I want to talk more about this raid that happens to his village when he's 19 in West Africa. And just to be clear, at the time, these are not slave traders. These are not white slave traders. This is a nearby kingdom.
Yes.
And this kingdom, and maybe talk a little bit about this dynamic. My understanding is this kingdom was a very powerful kingdom, a very rich kingdom, and it was that way because what it did was it captured people, Africans, neighbors, and sold them into slavery.
Yes, absolutely. The Fon of Dahomey were just this horrific, very powerful entity in that region. There's so much about the Dahomeyan people and their heritage, their culture, their customs, really remarkable and wonderful. And at the same time, there's this aspect of their culture and society which basically allowed them the belief and the will to capture others within their environment. And this is how they quote unquote grew their wealth as well as their power, and they were a dominant force. What they would do is as the Dahomeyan army would move through the area, the region, and, depending on what particular village they were passing, they would ask for food, for provisions for their army. If they were not provided, it was assumed that, okay, you're at war with the kingdom of Dahomey.
That's right. You either provide us food because we are a warring dynasty or a kingdom, since we're not making our own food. So you either provide us with food, and if not, then we're going to take you as slaves. I mean, that was the deal, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That was it. And Kosala's king refused to give up the food that was needed to feed his people. He said, this is for my people. I can't do that. They didn't declare war as such, and they didn't conduct war at that time, but they came back. They went on about their business and circled back and caught them at that pre-dawn time. And like you said, those that they captured, well, they had two uses for the people that they captured. They would use them in their own ceremonies in Dahomey at Abomey, where the capital was, or they would detain them in these barracoons and then sell them to Europeans who would come to get their so-called cargo. So yes, and in doing that, they waxed rich and became even more powerful. So yeah, it was the Fawn of Dahomey who dominated that region, who captured Kosala, people from his village and people from surrounding villages, because the warriors were actually coming down from the north, and when they also waged their campaign against Kosala's village.
And the warriors were women.
The warriors were women and men.
Yeah.
They were women and men. The Amazons were women. And Kosala talks about how fierce they were. And as he describes it in his narrative, it was the Amazons who came into the homes within the village. It was the women who came in to those rooms to where they were sleeping or just waking up and committed that awful slaughter. The male warriors were positioned outside around the walls of the village, so that those that the Amazons had not captured or killed and who were trying to escape, if they were able to escape the Amazon women, then the male warriors would then either kill or capture them. So the way it was set up, the women would go in and basically, initiate the first round of slaughter and capture. Any who managed to escape them would be then either slaughtered or captured by the male warriors.
Just a gruesome story. And as I said earlier, Zora Neale Hurston describes him telling this story as being lost in his own thoughts, not even being aware of his own surroundings. And she just gets up and leaves, and he doesn't say goodbye, like we pointed out earlier. But I have to tell you, when I'm reading that part, I also am fully engrossed in that story. And I too forget about where I am when I was reading that part. Deborah Plant, can you tell me again, his name is Kosala, but in America he uses Cujo Lewis. Why that name?
The way he explains it in the narrative is that for whites, as he put it, his name was too crooked to call. And so initially, Kosala has only one name, and it's Kosala. And it's only after his, acculturation process into American society and culture that he chooses a second name, which was his father's name. That's where Oluwale comes from. That was the name of his father. He says in the African soil, we have only one name. But here in the American soil, you have to have two. And so where Cujo comes from is that it's a West African name that means boy child born on a Monday. So Cujo is not very far from his cultural roots. And Lewis, I'm not absolutely sure, but I think it's some kind of variation of Oluwale. or Lewis, right? So because not very many people in America would take the time to pronounce his name correctly, Kosala, he just went by that, as he says in the narratives, like, well, since basically you quote unquote own me, then that's what we'll use. And so he used that name, Cujo Lewis, but we're very clear that this is not his choice. This is not his choice in terms of how he identifies himself. And we know that because when Hurston goes to visit with him and, to continue the interviews, she calls him Kosala. And he responds, and she says, when she calls him that, he just lights up and he responds, he says, I know it's you. I know it's you calling my name, because nobody calling my name from across the water but you. And as they get into the interview, he tells her very, very adamantly, very clearly, very passionately, he says, my name, not Cujo Lewis. My name, Kosala. And that's why I refer to him as Kosala, because this is how he identified. This is who he was for himself. What he allowed others to do in terms of how they called him, that was a matter of convenience, practicality, and, on a certain level of submission to people who were going to basically call you what they wanted to call you anyway. But in his own environment, in his own sense of who he was Kosala.
I cannot tell you how engrossing this story is of Kosala that is written by Zora Neale Hurston, but in Kosala's, it's really not even in the first word. It's actually what she is doing as an anthropologist in this book. The book is actually about her and him together, talking about his life story. I mean, she's in the book as herself, Zora Neale Hurston, talking to this man, Kosala, who had this, the hero's journey in some ways. And it's just this powerful book that's all told within about 100 pages or so. And it's just, it's one of my favorite books, and I'm very happy to be able to offer it to you for your support of this radio station that you are listening to in this radio program, Letters and Politics. And I just want to tell you quickly that one of our very own listeners, before we get back to the program, Sarah in San Francisco, is actually putting up $400, but has made it conditional. Now, I'm assuming, I didn't talk to Sarah myself personally, but I'm assuming what happens is people hear other people putting up large amounts of money and making them conditional, saying that if you could raise this amount of money in this amount of time, then I'll throw in this amount of money. And what they do is they help us double that amount. So this $400 that is coming from Sarah, potentially in the next 10 minutes, could be turned, more like 9 minutes, could be turned into $800. And that would start us to get us towards this $3,000 goal that's really important for us to be able to make today. So it's four people going to their phones, pledging $100, getting this book, Barracoon, The Story of the Last Black Cargo. It's edited by our guest today, Deborah Plant, who is an Africana Studies scholar, also African-American literary critic. She's the one who helped publish this book that remained unpublished for decades. It's just, it wasn't, I can tell you, and we'll talk about why it didn't get published, but it wasn't because it's not good. There's a whole lot of other reasons, including racism, why it wasn't published for decades. But it is one of the most powerful stories about these two people coming together and telling the story of the man in 1927, Kosala, who was the last surviving man to have actually grown up in Africa, been kidnapped, brought over, enslaved here in the United States, freed after the Civil War, and then how, along with other slaves, made a new world, made a new life in the American South. So the phone number, we have we have until 52 after, really. So we're now about 8 minutes to go to raise this $400 to turn it into $800. This is a big deal for us. Now would be a great time to get your call in. The number is, for our listeners to KPFA and KFCF, 1-800-439-5732, 1-800-439-5732, online at kpfa.org. And in Southern California, our friends in Los Angeles, 818-985-5735. That's for KPFK, 818-985-5735, and online at kpfk.org. Your donation does go to your radio station. $25 pledge makes you a member. $50 pledge gets us $50 closer where we need to be. Again, this is always true. I don't know how effective it is when I say it, but it's very true. What we ask for is a contribution that is according to your means. And for some people, that's $25. For some people, that's $200 or more, right? But if we can get folks, if they appreciate the show, if they find value in this radio program, that if you could donate what you can according to what you have, I believe we can make this work. So here's the number again for KPFA in Northern California and also KFCF. The phone number, 1-800-439-5732, 1-800-439-5732, or online at kpfa.org. And in Southern California, KPFK, 818-985-5735, 818-985-5735, and online at kpfk.org. We now return to our conversation with Deborah Plant. Slavery, as we know, ends in 1865. Tell me about the founding and development of Africatown.
1865, April the 10th, I believe it was. The Union soldiers have come into Alabama, and the coastline is there working, loading or unloading materials from one of the ships, the steamboats that he worked on. And the Union soldiers see him and they tell him, it says, "You're free. You don't have to do that anymore. You don't have to stay here anymore. You don't have to work for these people anymore. You're free." And being free, well, there's being free, and then there is, okay, now within this new status that I have, what do I do? And the soldiers told him, there are some houses there that you can go where you can have some kind of some place to stay and that kind of thing. But basically they had to figure it out for themselves what to do. Kosla and his compatriots, they didn't have, anyone to come and tell them about the Freedmen's Bureau and all of that kind of thing. Some others in the environment did, but he did not. And in their starting over, they had a little shelter, but in the starting over, what they did was basically begin to work at those places where they were held in bondage. In doing that work and getting paid some little wage for that, they thought that they could go home. They could save enough money to return to their home, which is what they wanted to do, always wanted to do. And when they found that they could never save enough because the passage, the cost was so dear, that they resolved that they had to stay in where they were in Alabama. And having resolved to stay where they were, they said, well, we're going to need some land to build our houses on. They couldn't just, continue to stay in the shelters that they were in. They wanted their own homes. And so their reasoning was that, Timothy Mayer brought them over they stole them and brought them over into Alabama, took them away from a land where a home where they had land, and they had means to make a living for themselves, and they were taken away from that and brought into Alabama. So the reason was that Timothy Mayer ought to assist them in getting back to Africa, for one thing. And that's when they decided they would try to save and return. They decided they would do that themselves rather than ask Mayer for passage home. But when they found that they couldn't go, they said that they would ask Timothy Mayer for some land so that they could build their homes. So Kosala was chosen by the group to go and speak with Timothy Mayer. And he's in the woods one day chopping. Timothy Mayer had a paper mill and all that kind of thing. And so he was working, chopping wood when Timothy Mayer came. And Kosala said, he felt like this was the right time to speak for his people, to speak for land for his people. So he stops chopping, this tree that he's chopping down, and Timothy Mayer is there, and as Kosala puts it, no longer does he hear the axe fall on the tree, and so he looks up and he asks Kosala, "Why are you so sad?" And Kosala says, he wants land so bad for his people that he just wants to cry. And so he tells him, he says, "Captain Tim, you brought us here to America. We had land in Africa, and over here we have nothing. They free us, but they free us with nothing. And, since you brought us here, why don't you give us a little piece of this land?" And Timothy Mayer jumps up and he calls him a fool. He says, "Fool, do you think I'm going to throw property after property? I'm not going to give you anything. I took good care of my slaves during slavery time, and you don't belong to me no more anyway. I don't owe you anything." And so this is what Kosala had to take back to his community. And so what the community decided was, you know what? Then we'll just buy that piece of land. And so they worked, the men worked, the women worked, and they pooled their monies, and they bought one parcel of land and then another, and amongst them, from 1 acre to 2 to 3 to however many that, they were able to buy, then on that land, they founded Africatown. Once they had the land, as Kosala explains it in his narrative, then they didn't hire people to build their houses for them. They built their houses themselves, and they would all help one another to, communally build the houses that for people who were ready to build their houses. And so this is how, this is the foundation of Africatown.
Just an amazing story. You can actually still visit Africatown today. We have been in conversation with Deborah G. Plant. She has edited and helped put together the final publication of the book, Barracoon, The Story of the Last Black Cargo, about the life of Kosala, a man who grew up in Western Africa, was kidnapped, brought over to the United States through the Middle Passage at the bottom of his ship, was enslaved up through the Civil War, and then after the Civil War was freed, and as you heard, created what's called Africatown with other former slaves. It's a touching story, and I think an important story, and a story that most people should know about. And I think this book, Barracoon, which is written by the great Zora Neale Hurston, and you get a real sense of her work as an anthropologist through this, should be on everyone's bookshelf. Should be required reading for everyone. It's not one of those difficult books to get through. It's about 100 pages. Could do it in a couple of days. I did it in a couple of days. And I was enthralled as I was reading it, especially when he was sitting at the fire in conversation with Zora Neale Hurston. And they're sitting there at the fire, looking at the fire, and he's lost in thought as he's telling her about the story of his kidnapping. And then he was so zoned in and telling that story that she left, and he didn't even notice that she left. And the way she described it, it just puts you right there at the fire with them. I mean, I had that feeling myself as I was reading it. Friends, we are offering this important book for a pledge of $100 here in our Winter 2020 Fund Drive. The phone number, if you're listening to KPFA, is 1-800-439-5732, 1-800-439-5732, or online at kpfa.org. Now, in Southern California, that phone number to KPFK is 818-985-5735, 818-985-5735, online at kpfk.org. I do want to tell you, we did make that previous challenge from Sarah in San Francisco. Our total right now is actually $800. So we made it precisely. And now here we are, $800. And we still need to raise an additional $2,200 if we're going to make our goal. And we have 4.5 minutes remaining in the hour. Now, it could sound like that's an impossibility, but not quite, because we have another listener. And this is what happens. They hear other listeners and they're like, okay, this is what I can do. I have some money I could donate here. And that's Bob in Canyon. Bob in Canyon has put up $600. If our final 4 minutes together right now, we could raise $600 together, that would be $1,200. At least gets us a giant step forward towards trying to make that challenge. If we can't raise this money, because $600 is a lot, and Bob wants to know, like, hey, if we can't, wants to put in $600, right? Like to do it, like to do his part and support this radio station, but you don't want to put $600 somewhere if it's not going to be there a month, 2 months, 4 months down the road. And it's always a possibility. We are a fund drive to fund drive kind of operation around here. So $600 right now could be doubled if we can get 6 people at the $100 mark in getting this very important book, Barracoon. The phone number for KPFA listeners, and this also counts for KFCF listeners in Fresno, is 1-800-439-5732, 1-800-439-5732, online at kpfa.org. And in Southern California, listening to KPFK, the number is 818-985-5735, 818-985-5735, and online at kpfk.org. You may be wondering, what is our strategy in this fund drive? We always have tried to take fund drive very seriously and tried to bring programming that's educational. We hope that would broaden horizons, something that would give you a story for a day, for an hour that you can get lost in. This fund drive, because of our impeachment journey, and to me, it was like a serious constitutional journey. There's a lot of folks out there who say, oh, that was just a complete waste of time. I couldn't disagree more, actually. I thought it was, if done right, and I thought we did the very best we could on this radio station in trying to make it a constitutional journey and understanding how government works and understanding how checks and balances work, how understanding what norms are and what happens when they break down, and, what does impeachment even mean? For us, the outcome wasn't what was important. What was important was trying to dive into what was actually happening in political life in the United States here in 2020. But because that took up so much time, we actually weren't able to do one of those super duper, specials as we have done in the past. So what we're going to do this time in the drive, and then I got knocked out with the flu. These things happen. So what we are going to do is we're going to do my favorite books, actually, that we have done on this program. And Barracoon is one of my favorite books. And people say books, they tell me, Mitch, books don't work in fund drive. People don't want to pledge for books. And to me, that's really problematic, because books are kind of my life. I love books, and I love offering books. And I like that people would support public radio, pledge $100, and to be able to give you in exchange a book. And not just any book, but today, Barracoon. Tomorrow we're going to do Shakespeare and Politics, which is a lot of fun with Stephen Greenblatt. But today we're doing Barracoon, Deborah Plant, Zora Neale Hurston's first manuscript that wasn't published for decades. If I could give that to you as a thank you gift for a pledge of $100, to me that's actually kind of a cool thing. That's a special thing, and I hope you would like that too. So the number again, the phone number for KPFA listeners and KFCF listeners is 1-800-439-5732, 1-800-439-5732, and online at kpfa.org. And in Southern California, the number is 818-985-5735,
818-985-5735. Online at kpfk.org. 30 seconds to go, but listen, friends, you can still get your calls and go online for the next 4 minutes and have it count towards the $600 challenge. At the very moment, we're at $300, so we are $300 short of that $600 challenge. I can only give you the number one last time, and I just got to put it in your hands and see how it goes. Here it is for KPFA, 1-800-439-5732, 1-800-439-5732. For KPFK, 818-985-5735. Thank you.